Cities After is a bi-monthly podcast about the future of cities. Grounded in our daily urban struggles, it is part dystopian and part utopian. My intention is to entice your civic imagination into action, because we know that a more just and sustainable urban future is possible. This is Miguel Robles-Duran, and I dare you to imagine our cities after.
COVID,
global warming,
gentrification,
exploitation,
homelessness,
racism,
colonialism,
patriarchy,
hunger,
police brutality,
religion,
private property.
Capitalism. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work.
In this episode, I will attempt to shed some light on the impact of inter-urban competition as it is structured by supranational organizations. I'm going to talk about how these supranational organizations are the ones that are actually determining and deciding the contemporary urbanization patterns we all see around us, which include the dominant cultural strategies, property development trends, labor practices, and the forms of municipal governance that make our cities today. Parallel to the historical revolutions in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and a lot of the highly symbolic events that came with the fall of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, we're talking here the end of the 1980s, which marked a beginning of a signing trend of transnational free trade associations. This signing trend began with perhaps the most notable Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Treaty, which is normally referred to as the APEC, and this happened in 1989. And then continued with one that was called the Southern Common Market, known as the Mercosur in 1991. And of course, the infamous North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, in 1992. And concluding that period with perhaps the most ambitious treaty of all, which was the Maastricht Treaty that established the European Union in 1993. Now, the emphasis placed by these treaties on private sector competitiveness, combined with a mass of deregulatory tendencies brought on by neoliberalization on most sectors of the world economy, resulted in the design of a very different kind of governance apparatus that I call a supranational governance apparatus. And the idea of this apparatus was to sustain and to reproduce the dramatic economic transformations that were being envisioned by those thinking on how to make the world neoliberal. It is very important to understand that in addition to the changes that came with the new economic and political demands of supranational free treaties, neoliberal advocates also had to urge a radical transformation of the territorial politics embedded in the conceptions of nation state. Now, territorial politics are something that are very different than urban politics. Territorial politics become so abstract to a point that most inhabitants don't actually comprehend how the boundaries of different countries are trespassed or are fixed. And in these territorial politics, they had to transform it in a way that they strategically undermined the political limits and protectionisms in the form of what is called anti-dumping regulation, border inspections, taxation of foreign goods, and health certifications. And secondly, by heavily altering the territorial and urban development structures on mostly two scales. At the global scale, the territorial politics that I was referring to redefine continental and transcontinental trade blocs. This was done through the drafting of new corridors that directed the flow of laborers, natural resources, manufacturing goods, food, services, and other commodities. These new corridors helped blur the power of democratically structured political jurisdictions by offering much more legal control and determination to the privately defined supranational organizations, in many cases bypassing constitutional conventions, bypassing democratic structures. At the city scale, these treaties were enacted in a very different way. And this was done through the promotion of competitiveness between different urban centers and the ability to provide necessary incentives and infrastructures for becoming international manufacturing, trade, or business hubs. So all of these done obviously at the service of free trade. And these urban centers began to compete with each other through the capture and concentration of manufacturing plants, obviously through the concentration of armies of low-wage laborers, of logistic facilities, of transportation infrastructures, of high-tech communications, cultural districts, luxury dwellings, modern corporate office spaces, and of course, shopping quarters. So here we see two simultaneous types of urban development that becomes a very important focus for the success of these neoliberal treaties. One, defined by competition between cities of low-cost sourcing. This is how I define them. And these are completely exemplified by cities like Tijuana, Mexico, or Craiova in Romania, or Plovdiv in Bulgaria, Shenzhen in China, Chennai in India, Canton in Vietnam, and the like. And another kind of cities that had to be part of the competition as aspiring headquarters cities. Now, these cities were designed to provide high-skilled services, luxury lifestyle footprints, corporate operations, and examples are amassed too, right? Dublin in Ireland, San Francisco in the US, obviously New York City, Singapore, Helsinki, Shanghai, Yokohama, etc. In all of these cases, but especially in the European Union, supranational institutions and private consultancy firms such as McKinsey and PricewaterhouseCoopers took the advising lead on their competitive transformation. And this is quite a major development in the way cities are produced today. In urban centers, while a nation state continued to financially support urbanization through classic channels such as fiscal redistribution and special projects, these supranational organizations were offering municipal governments more development resources and a higher status in the global economy. This new competitive city had to focus on finding and opening private investment spaces that could allow private capital to locate its highest and best use. The high authority of transnational free trade agreements that empowered supranational organizations and international privacy consultancy firms began to manifest in space once these key municipal governments started facilitating the request. This is the rise of the neoliberal city-state, and without doubt is best exemplified in cities like London, New York City, Moscow, Beijing, and was a direct consequence of a very, very well-orchestrated neoliberal political and economic dynamic system. And when I mean very well-orchestrated, is that it was designed and implemented by those supranational governance bodies that I was talking at the beginning of this cast. So I'm arguing here that this rise of global cities was not a direct result of the influence of maverick mayors or creative people or billionaires or visionary architects, as is commonly preached by superstar neoliberal urban thinkers like Richard Florida or Edward Glaser or Benjamin Barber or Jennifer Bradley and all of their well-hyped books. If there is an argument common to these authors, it is that the successful urban transformations will be proportional to any city's capacity to, I quote here, Glaser, attract smarter people and enable them to work collaboratively. There's no such thing as a successful city without human capital. So what most of these neoliberal urban thinkers were saying is that, simply put, the neoliberal urban formula for global triumph was to get urban managers, mayors, or any people in governance to attract the best, the smartest, and the most creative people, and all the requisite rewards and advantage of having them would follow suit. And here we would have to ask the question, what would a city need to do to attract such desirable human capital? And this is where the advice and services of reformed supranational organizations and a huge army of private consultancy firms became very useful, and in many ways continues to be imperative. Once the inter-urban competition began, few city mayors wanted to fall behind. And so city mayors commissioned advice from the experts behind the visionary formula, and this proliferation of consultancy firms became a very important component of urban development. So I feel that it is no surprise that the authors of these neoliberal urbanization books and the opinions that they have on them, such as creative class cities and so on, it is no surprise they continue to take central stage in global forums and advisory panels, and all of them, of course, supported by these leading supranational organizations. And this is in spite of the many social ills, the economic crisis, political scandals, and environmental disasters that can readily be linked to the advice of these supranational bodies and private consultancy firms with their global economic agenda, and continues to be described and continues to be pushed in reports of the OECD, the World Economic Forum, UN Habitat, and the like. So since the mid-1990s, hundreds of cities around the world and from all continents have taken the promulgated formula as a main directive for development, inter-urban competition. However, the pursuit of inter-urban competitiveness, I think, was never as dramatic as it was in Western Europe. And this was thanks to the development of commonalities brought by a very strong faith in the European Union project, through the creation of a less regulated private finance industry, the creation of a new central bank that was going to be based in Frankfurt, and as well a very large access to private consultancy firms and supranational organizations. So most cities in Western Europe were very well positioned to allocate all their available resources to the competition for human capital, and with it, foreign direct investment. Competitiveness through the promotion of entrepreneurship and innovation had become, by the end of the 1990s, a unified priority of the sovereign European Union. And this was even laid out in the European Union's Commission's 1999 action plan, and I will quote, which says, "Promoting entrepreneurship and innovation has moved center stage in the European Union enterprise policy. The creation of a business environment that encourages the creation and growth of new businesses and new sectors is key to improving the competitiveness of Europe's economy." And I end that quote here. So this commonly articulated goal, I think, reveals the many levels of governmental decision and decision making that have been imposed on European urbanization, as most of its cities struggle to turn around their fortunes. Since mid-1990s, European urbanization assumed a very, very distinct role, and I think very unique in a global perspective, of spatializing competitiveness. And with that, of course, it has also done a great job of materializing the contradictions of competitiveness. In the course of this entrepreneurial turn in Europe, supranational neoliberal policy and its critical dependency on the specific types of urban and territorial development has been executed through applied tactics of mass citizen displacement, predatory speculation, gentrification, uneven property taxations, discriminatory urban policies, environmental disasters, flexibilization of labor, and among so many other urban instruments for advancing the free market order. On the developmental side of economic growth, this European turn not only forced cities to attract the right kind of entrepreneurs, normally sought like a high-income employees and with some kind of fancy sources of employment as suggested by these neoliberal writers such as Barber in Florida. And by now, so urban managers or mayors had to also develop new and better economic and fiscal incentives to become competitive. And these new fiscal incentives included, of course, tax credits for new enterprises, the lowering of corporate tax rates, the relocation of credits, new building credits, free land for development, startup accelerator programs, and most of them favoring private foreign direct investors, and how the competitiveness turn touched every single industry in the Eurozone. I'm talking here all banks, all insurers, all postal services, airlines, health providers, communication, manufacturing, education, food companies, you name it, that did not subscribe to the neoliberal logic were either slowly restructured or replaced or destroyed by new mergers or new multinational sort of acquisitions or compliant corporations. By the end of the 1990s, already Europe had developed an extensive catalog of best practices. And now, let me say here that the idea of best practices is an idea that was promoted by the OECD, one of those supranational organizations that I was talking about, and to a certain extent through the IMF, right? It was trying to tell cities that this is a best practice, this is what you guys should do. And these best practices were assembled from different regional, national, or urban cases that successfully demonstrated how to transition towards becoming more competitive. This was not a situation of a best practice for social good. Best practices, by definition, were about what made more competitive specific areas in the city or specific industries. So these, together with the strong support of private consultancies again, global finance industry, and all of the surveillance and benchmarking that is provided by these supranational organizations, it was like a perfect push for all countries in the EU to put in place the local governance systems that were necessary to become, like I would say, continental entrepreneurs. So once all of those governance systems were set up, it was time for cities and their empowered mayors to conceive, to design, to produce, to imagine, to venture, the production of these new spaces that would be required to attract these investments, these new headquarters, these new job-y, super highly educated people that, according to every writer at that time, was going to incentivize competition and make cities better. So what are these best practices that were followed by the great majority of European cities? Well, these best practices were the development of the London Docklands that provided massive fiscal incentives to corporations and developers. Or the other best practice was the usage of private-public partnerships in the production of mega events like Barcelona Olympics. Or the best practice of how to privatize social housing quarters in Dutch cities. Or another best practice of the development of pedestrianized shopping districts within city centers. Of course, another best practice would be the provision of new high-tech luxury housing quarters, the construction of branded cultural commodities. Of course, the Guggenheim Bilbao shines very brightly in this. So this new urbanization trend, commanded by best practices, demanded extreme compliance from city mayors and bureaucrats, for which it was imperative to forego the social value of publicly owned buildings and spaces to private developers. And this was in the hopes of making the city more attractive to the right kind of people, foreign investors, people with a lot of money, and multinational companies. And of course, these projects had to maximize rent values, and as doing so, they were deemed beneficial to the health of a recently deregulated financial circuit in which most cities were embedded in. So it was through these mechanisms that architects and urban designers became professionals in especially high demand. So these architects were no longer appointed by the city, as I was discussing in my previous podcast, but they were appointed by investment conglomerates in partnership with government bodies. And by doing so, these designers were given an absolute creative freedom. And this was necessary to achieve the spectacular anchors that definitely materialize a new competitive climate. Developer partnerships were now appointing designers as producers of visual spectacle. It was necessary, according to the marketing consultants. And these were because they were attracting investment and because they were giving designated zones a competitive edge over other parts of other cities. So even though at the beginning they might have been iconic elements such as, a one-of-a-kind Guggenheim in Bilbao, it ended up being a mass of buildings alike in every city in Europe. And of course, this led to one of the most homogenizing characters of contemporary European cities. And I say jokingly, but it's very true. We're talking here about designer fountains, designer benches, designer lighting, designer buildings, designer plazas, designer bridges, designer clocks, designer art, designer everything in the new pseudo-public and private spaces that could lure these foreign investment into cities. Now, by that same token, public spaces were being saturated by art pieces of a similar kind. They were secured, of course, commodified, cleansed of everything that need not favor the new purpose of promoting competitiveness. So architects and urban designers could not have been more in vogue, and they were important, very important instruments of this high-stakes competition. So following the advice of consultants and their supranational supporters, all cities needed at least one new and shiny architecture icon. The use of public money was justified because investors loved them. Consequently, the architect rose to unprecedented levels of stardom. In some instances, the status of a Hollywood celebrity or a top politician was equal to the status of an architect. The idea of architects traveling millions of air miles per year became somehow a measure for success as a designer in the new competitive economy. So fierce competition between the best producers of attractive urban amenities and between city mayors that wanted their exclusive, somehow creative genius, ensued. All kinds of artists and designers were battling each other as they searched for the next world city. Where should I put my new stamp? And that was, of course, the next world city ready to become more competitive. At this point, we start to see LEED certified designer skyscrapers soaring in Dubai and London. By now, Guggenheim museums were being projected in cities like Helsinki and Guadalajara and Abu Dhabi. Supersized urban sculptures were being commissioned from Shanghai to Chicago. New high-tech businesses districts were being planned for Moscow, but also for Buenos Aires. And new global events, biennales, triennials, were being curated from Lisbon to Shenzhen, and you name it. The art and architectonic spectacle had become a very integral part of those that seek the neoliberal urban lifestyle. And it was a preferred weapon for winning the competition. But here I ask, who was winning? As cities became saturated with designer and art spaces, the reality of such contributions was becoming apparent to the majority of people that were not participating in this spectacle production. Parallel to a lot of concentration in urban investments, we began to experience a notable decline in neighborhoods and as well as in the general quality of daily life. The new centers of urban investment were not only absorbing the resources needed by other city spaces and by other inhabitants, but they were drawing away investment from basic social infrastructures, such as schools, libraries, hospitals, affordable housing, and the like. So these spectacle-driven spaces, they were centered, that constructed or structured and shaped from the outset as I would call parasites. They were parasitical on those who were excluded. This new type of urbanization was sucking the lifeblood of the city in order to service the emerging financial elites and their notion of what a city should be like. In their terms, a very clean, lively, highly secure, with a casual public character, with some kind of prepackaged cultural atmosphere, obviously with high-end shopping districts or Michelin-star restaurants, where CEOs, millionaires, and billionaires could just stroll safely and can mingle with a number of these new kind of creative professionals. Systematized urban competitiveness has proven to be a very invaluable development strategy for the world's neoliberal system elites. As one of their guiding ideologies, it just continues to contribute highly to the rampant maldistribution of global wealth. It has allowed for record-breaking accumulations of capital and has magnified the competition between workers, driving down their wages and their welfare. With supranational diligence, selective urbanization became one of the most favored emerging markets of the neoliberal age. But I argue that cities are not like ordinary commodities. To begin with, they are spaces where most of the contemporary human activity is concentrated, where social relations are produced and reproduced, where we sleep, eat, and fall in love. And consequently, any exploitation of these spaces as markets has a byproduct of directly transforming the livelihood of cities' residents. So these two differentiations of cities explain why the average urban dweller has had a lot to lose from the applied paradigm of systemized urban competitiveness. We can say that the losers reflect the billions in public money that could have been used for a diverse array of social, cultural, health, and education programs. And rather than being used for these, they were reallocated to subsidize profitable private developments. Examples of these private developments would be Hafen City in Hamburg, with Wilhelmina Pier in Rotterdam, Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn, Puerto Madero in Buenos Aires, Moscow City in Moscow, or the Pueblo Nou district in Barcelona. These are just a handful of hundreds of examples of this worldwide trend. I think millions of square meters of public land that were given away or privatized in the name of competitiveness. For example, Copenhagen has been promoted the private development of 11 man-made islands called Enhagebrige. In this development, 42% of the land needed is publicly owned. It would be transferred to the owners of the project, many of them foreign private equity firms. Or let's talk about the case of the Guggenheim in Helsinki, for which the city would give away one of its most symbolic pieces of public land to a highly lucrative multinational private art foundation. A third losing point is that real estate prices that surround the competitive interventions have become inaccessible to the majority of urban populations. Only wealthy individuals, large corporations, banks, equity firms can fully profit from these boosted property values. This obviously includes access to the many luxurious spaces of consumption and leisure that typically complement many of the new office and housing developments that developers love to build. A fourth losing point is that for locals, The new developments provided very few secure long-term employment opportunities, even among high-skilled workers. Coercion from supranational bodies to increase labor market flexibilization meant shorter-term contracts and huge pressure on local workforce to compete with the influx of foreign labor that came with new foreign direct investment. And this was done at the expense of local and national economies. Foreign direct investment was universally seen as the engine of economic growth for cities and nations alike. A fifth losing point is that unless they were of iconic importance, public investment in local cultural venues and programs diminished as they were placed in competition with new breed of very well subsidized high-profile museums, high-profile concert halls, opera houses, theaters, events and stadiums that were specifically designed to promote cultural destination competitiveness. A sixth losing point is that on the political front, the power of democracy does little to determine the outcomes for any city or region when its effective sovereignty is bypassed by these multinational treaties and by, of course, transnational and supranational organizations. Non-democratic supranational impositions give governors and city mayors the power to attract capital and compete with others. But by doing so, they erode the capacity to act in the benefit of those who elected them. For the global economy that they serve, a major success is normally measured by competitiveness indexes that benchmark the capacity of a major to attract business, to create a good business climate for investors. Now, I talk here about 6 losing points. And these are 6 losing points of the interurban competitiveness that came with neoliberalization. These 6 points exemplify them, and for the general population, it is difficult to conceive the full spectrum of the effects that the competitiveness turn has had on the environment, on our daily life of those of us that live in cities. In any competition, as prescribed by capitalism, someone has to win. In this short podcast, I have tried to show why I don't think that society at large had much of a chance in the high stakes of urban restructuring in the last 30 years. So who did win? The neoliberal makeover of urban development has been like a discounted shopping mall for billionaire investors, for finance companies and multinational corporations. Cities around the world have been fighting for their favors, offering all kinds of things such as tax-free zones, low corporate tax rates, free land, free buildings, access to public money, low interest credit, state-of-the-art infrastructures, and of course cheap and flexible labor. As the beneficiaries roam around the planet looking for the next best investment climate on offer, the cities that these capitalists abandon in their search for more profit are just left with the understanding that it's just nothing personal. It's just business.
This was another episode of Cities After. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.